This episode is brought to you by our wonderful patrons. If you enjoy the Coffee and Cocktails podcast, feel free to support our show by becoming a patron for as little as £1 per month. By subscribing to our show, you get early access to ad-free and bonus episodes, patron-only content, and a chance to talk with our coolest guest speakers. Speaking of patron-only content, in July, we'll be hosting our first live special episode with startup guru Brady Simpson. To learn more, follow us on LinkedIn or check out our website at coffeeandcocktailspodcast.com. Otherwise, we'd like to give a shout out to our Gold Star member, Mary M. Thanks for listening, and on with the show. Hello, and welcome to the 28th episode of Coffee and Cocktails. I'm your host, Dr. Ann Wand. This month, on our new Controversies and Contraband series, we have the pleasure of talking with our first guest speaker, Dr. Banu Karaca, who will be talking to us about her work on Nazi materials. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Well, it's a pleasure. And I'll have to say, could you tell us what drink you were having for the show, followed by a little bit about yourself? Would you like to start?
Yes, I would like to say something very extravagant, but I can't. I'm actually having a fruit smoothie because I didn't have time for lunch. And this has to time me over for now. And a little bit about myself. And I'm an anthropologist by training. I work on the politics of art, and more generally, I'm interested in the governance of art from a perspective of political anthropology. And I generally, geographically speaking, work across Germany and Turkey, or the greater European, Near Eastern, Middle Eastern context. And I came to you because I'm interested in censorship and moments in which censorship occurs in the art world. And that's how we sort of got in touch when I saw your call to talk about banned materials.
Yeah. So, kind of just to give you an idea of how the series started, because I've always had this idea in my head of, I think it's one of the things about podcasting is it's in business, they say, you should focus on what your clients want. And I definitely think from a business standpoint, that's important. But I think when it comes to podcasting, you need to also think about, what do you want? Because if you're not interested in it, then everybody's going to know you're not interested in it. And I had this copy of Mein Kampf just sitting on my shelf for ages. Wow. And every time people came over, I always had to sort of hide it. So I don't want people to think that I was some secret Nazi supporter. But I have always been interested in how texts have power and how they can sort of move people. And so when I started this series, I was thinking I'd do a series on maybe Mein Kampf, maybe one on the Salman Rushdie affair. And for those that are listening, if you happen to be a specialist on it or know somebody is, please contact me. The Gnostic Bibles, but this idea that, material has power and that it can sort of move people. So when you reached out to me saying that you actually specialize in Nazi materials and how these historical relics and documents, how they sort of have an impact on society today, I thought, oh my gosh, I have to talk to you. This is exactly the sort of thing that I want to dive into. So I guess my first question for you is, what led you to begin your work on studying Nazi materials in the first place?
Yeah, it wasn't actually intended, to be honest. As I said, I work on the politics of art or the governance of art. And what I noticed is when you work on artistic expression from the perspective of the state and how the state aims to regulate artistic expression or support it, there is a sort of working principle underneath that of what we know as modern cultural policy. And that is the idea that art, in principle, is inherently beneficial, that it is a civilizing force. Sometimes that is expressed in very national terms, right? That it is important for the community, that is supposedly expressed within the form of the nation state. But sometimes it can also take on more universal formulations, like that art is, an expression of our common humanity. But every now and then, during my research, I came across artistic expressions that were seen as harmful, as eroding of the national community or context, or that were not fulfilling the civilizing mission that is often accorded to art, or that are harmful, not inherently good, but actually inherently harmful. And within Germany, most of these expressions, in some shape or form, sometimes very explicitly and sometimes implicitly, and I think I'll talk about an example of that, with reference back to the Nazi past. Perhaps I should leave it at that, and then we get more into details.
So, because I know in talking about the Nazi past, I mean, one of the things that I think those who maybe studied World War II history are familiar with is the idea that the Nazi Party, and maybe you could fill us in a bit more on this, they were collectors. They were art collectors. Hitler was an artist, and one of the things that you and I had talked about before recording on the show was that it's almost like taboo to say that Hitler was a good artist. And it's interesting because when I saw his art for the first time, this was some time ago, I thought, oh, that's a nice, it was like, I think a cathedral or something. And I thought, oh, that's a really nice, water painting. And then I had read some critiques some time ago saying, oh, his art was kind of so-so. I'm like, well, it's a lot better than mine. And I realized that I think if you were to say he was a good anything, he was a good brother, he was a good whatever, there's sort of certain, you can't attribute something good to somebody who is inherently evil. And I think within the art context, and I know we can dive into this a bit more, there are still some rules in terms of what you can constitute as you said, inherently good or inherently not so good or politically driven. And not to diverge too much, but seeing as Hitler was an artist before he then became a dictator, et cetera, I'd be curious to understand, this idea of the Nazis being art collectors, how that sort of had a political tone to it or undertaking behind it.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, you asked a very evocative question. I think on the one hand, in Germany, most people would say he's a failed artist. I think that's very important. In a way, he also sits squarely in the motif of the dictator artist that we know from, classical figures such as Nero to others. And indeed, Hitler being perhaps the most prominent, quote unquote, of those failed artists. And, there's films about what had happened if he had actually been accepted to art school, these kind of musings about would he still have wreaked that much pain and suffering over the world, really. But I've always wondered about this idea that someone who is bad, who's morally corrupt, who is cruel, that we have a problem thinking of someone like that as a good artist, On the other hand, we know that many misogynists, even men who have killed women, are internationally acclaimed artists to this day, or their images are only slowly being dismantled. Kenan Evren is another example from the Turkish context. He was the leader of the military junta that organized the 1980 coup d'etat in Turkey. He actually also was a hobby painter, and he opened an exhibition in the 1990s, which caused a lot of uproar. Exactly for the same reason. We tend to think, and I say this we in a very undefined kind of way, but most dominant public discourses think of art as inherently good and thus also as a moral kind of vestige that should preclude people from doing bad things. I know this is quite simplified, but just as a sort of idea when it comes to the person of Hitler himself. Overall, the fascist movement in Germany, the National Socialist movement, for them, aesthetics was not just a sort of decorative, but in many ways, the question of art and aesthetics was at the heart of the National Socialist rule. And when you say they were collectors, they were premier looters, for a long time. When we think about it was always called the biggest art theft in history, or for a long time. I think if we look at the colonial longue durée, of course, we might sort of dispute the numbers, but what we have to keep in mind is that at least in the 20th century, it was the largest planned campaign of looting art throughout Europe, especially, and much of the invasion of Paris and occupation of Paris was completely planned alongside art to be confiscated. I mean, there were already lists out there as to which works of art were to be confiscated from public collections. The same is true in the eastward expansion and a war of aggression of the Nazi regime, where art that was not seen as valuable was to be destroyed, whereas what was seen valuable, and here I'm not talking in monetary terms, but really the idea was that the possession of art itself was the expression of moral superiority.
Interesting.
So moral and political superiority. So it wasn't something that was cosmetic. It was at the heart of the way in which power was construed. And Walter Benjamin has in his essay of the art in the age of mechanical reproduction also talks about this difference between communism and fascism, as to how fascism does not, in contrast to communism, doesn't aestheticize. Where the aesthetic and the politic become congruent with each other. They're not separable, And I think this is something that is something that we have to keep in mind when we think about the way in which the Nazi art loot progressed throughout, not just within Germany, where especially Jewish collectors were subject to the confiscation and looting of art, but throughout Europe itself, in general.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. One of the things I wanted to tap into is that you stated in your bio that as a liberal democracy, Germany is often thought of as a champion of free speech, which I think is something we should dive into. Yet, along with the denial of the Holocaust, Nazi symbols, films, and writings lie outside of the constitutionally guaranteed what you call freedom of expression. They are either forbidden by law or their public use is subject to certain restrictions that are intimately connected to Germany's standing in the international community through what they refer to as a promise of, quote unquote, never again, as in we will never again do these things that we had done in the past. Could you explain to us why this is the case?
Yeah. So I think it's really important to understand, and this is, of course, true for other contexts as well. We can talk about the US, or perhaps you can bring examples from the UK. Liberal democracies pride themselves that freedom of expression is constitutionally guaranteed. Now, interestingly, freedom of the arts is not guaranteed everywhere in the same way. There's only, I think, 54 countries in the world that explicitly mention art as a separate sort of entity in their freedom of expression stipulations. Germany is one of them. But while Germany has a vested interest in portraying itself as a democracy that after 1945 has both faced its past, it's very invested in showing that it has faced its past, and that it also has the legal and social, created the legal and social conditions and political conditions for something like another war of aggression, of which there were, of course, World War I and World War II, or the National Socialist reign, can never happen again. And in that way, when you look closer, freedom of speech in Germany is not unfettered. It's not an unfettered right, as it is, for instance, in the US. But there are certain, and those were not established right away, not after 1945, which is also something I think people tend to forget, but rose really with a different kind of memory of the Holocaust from the 1980s onwards. We can talk about this in a little bit more detail in a moment. So there is in the Penal Code of Germany something called Article 86 that deals expressively with forbidden symbols. The swastika would be one of those, for instance, or the insignia of the SS or the ESA, that is the sort of different arms of the Nazi party. Those are forbidden by law.
Right.
Yeah. And so you wouldn't be... Oh, please go ahead.
So no, and I know we talked about this in another discussion, that even vocabulary, there are limitations. So as you said, in the US, there are words that you shouldn't use, especially from depending on the background that you come from, and people use them. You're not going to go to jail for them, or you're not going to get a fine for them. But if I understood correctly, you had said that even vocabulary, there are restrictions. It goes beyond taboos, and that if you said Nazi in public, that there could be potentially a fine associated with that if you called somebody that? No,
okay. It's not that, but it's sort of in terms of vocabulary or phrases. The denial of the Holocaust, for instance, is forbidden by law in Germany, and is punishable with also prison sentences, for instance. Notably, and again, this was not something that was instated right after 1945, but was instated in the mid-80s at a point where there was an effort by Germany to gain full sovereignty in the international community. To get into rearmament, which it had already started a few decades before, but always very, very slowly, very cautiously, and with allied military posts still existing as well, and so on. So the denial of the Holocaust was criminalized in 1985. That is often also regarded, I think, both from within and without Germany, as another, not as a restriction on freedom of expression, which you could argue, it is, but as a sign of its maturity as a democracy. Now, this argument is a very difficult one, but has to do really with this very specific history of Germany, and where it's also seen as an acknowledgement of the responsibility towards this past, and that it's not, that at that point, 40 years later, that it's still important to uphold a certain way of looking at that very past. But again, a closer look then reveals that the denial of the Holocaust could only pass as a law in German parliament on pressure of the conservative parties, the Christian Democratic Union, on their pressure that the denial of the expulsion of Germans from Eastern Europe was also criminalized. Okay. So what looks at first sight as a sort of very unique way of dealing with the Nazi past then actually becomes already as a law a little bit more questionable, because, the expulsion of Germans who had lived in Eastern Germany, some of which had settled there during the Third Reich, some of which have historically longer roots within Eastern Europe, is of course a very difficult topic, because it has been long taboo to accord victim status, taboo, so to speak. I mean, I always would caution to say it was really taboo. But to point to their suffering was often seen or interpreted as a sort of comparison to the victimhood and the suffering endured by Jewish people who had suffered in concentration camps and others who were victims of the war of extermination.
So if I understand correctly, it's almost to say that victimhood, and I want to be careful how I word this, but victimhood can be attributed to those who were directly impacted, Jewish community, gay community,
since it's a Roma,
those who were basically sentenced to death. But those who were not sentenced to death, but maybe lived in poorer living conditions, weren't maybe as economically capable of, as in better economic standing as opposed to those in other parts of Germany, they might have some backlash if they had claim to victimhood or wanted to have claim to victimhood. Is that correct?
The ones that are, there's two groups specifically. The one group is, people who lived up all the way into today's Russia. I mean, there were German settlements already previously, people who had fled, for instance, religious persecution in previous centuries. But then, of course, there were German settlers who had been settled in Eastern Europe as part of Nazi Germany's expansion. So if you are settled somewhere, or they're extremely, even if they had been there longer, they become very privileged during Nazi times because they, all of a sudden it's Germany occupying those territories. Okay. So they have benefited from Nazi rule, both politically and very often also materially benefited. So, to accord victim status to those who then had to flee from the Russian army was coming towards Berlin, it is, of course, a politically very difficult and also ethically very difficult sort of to navigate these questions.
No, that's a good point. If we could sort of step back a little bit before we start diving into some of the work that you've done, especially with your recent publication in the National Frame. Could you explain to our listeners, what does Nazi expressionism mean in the German context?
So what does Nazi expression mean is a bit, there's some things that are quite easy to be detected. As I said, anything that is a direct symbol of the Nazi party, for instance, swastikas, insignia, military insignia of the Wehrmacht during the Third Reich, for instance, those are quite easily determinable expressions, so to speak. Now, when it comes to questions of the arts, it becomes very difficult. I think I had mentioned in our previous conversation, there was a very popular rock band called Rammstein. I think they're still popular. But in the early 1990s, there was always some kind of question because they use a lot of these Nazi or fascist aesthetics that, your listeners might also be familiar with from, visuals from Leni Riefenstahl films, those big party rallies, that kind of monumental architecture and so on. But in that one music video that they did in the early 1990s, they used actually clips of Leni Riefenstahl's Olympic film, the film she had made, she had been commissioned to
Could you tell us a bit about that film, just for some of the listeners who may not be aware?
Yeah, so that it's called Fest der Völker in German. I think it's known in English as Olympia. And it was filmed during the Summer Olympics of 1936, where Nazi Germany wanted to show the world that, despite all their policies and their already very blatant anti-Semitism, how not only civilized they were, but also how superior, really, it was an exercise in also showing their supposed, purported political and moral superiority through sports. I mean, that was the sort of showcase they wanted to give to the world. And Leni Riefenstahl, a filmmaker who had already had connections to Adolf Hitler himself and to the Nazi Party overall. She had filmed previous party rallies at Nuremberg. If you ever give into YouTube just sort of Nazi rally Nuremberg, you will find her footage.
And that also ties into Triumph of the Will, correct?
Exactly. Triumph of the Will is one of those films. Yeah, is one of those films. So Olympia was her sort of documentation, quote unquote. I would really use this in quotation marks, because she pioneered a lot of the sort of kind of monumental perspectives. She shot she has a lot of shoots, not just of classically beautiful muscular bodies that she often filmed in poses that are akin to classical Roman or Greek sculptures. For instance, she used a lot of the camera frames she did, or the visual frames she took, were filming certain figures who she wanted to be elevated from below, so they look more towering and imposing. It's sort of a visual language of Aryan supremacy.
She did that with Hitler, didn't she? She would do the filming from, where he's on his podium and he's 2 feet tall, apparently in reality, but he would look quite tall. Apparently Tom Cruise, they do the same thing, but side note.
Well, I'm not going to say anything about that. But her specialty was also, capturing masses, and masses that are highly organized, put in orderly lines, and sort of her visual language of the monumental party grounds in Nuremberg, together with the sort of symbolism and of the Nazi party that was featured together with the masses. So she's really, actually, it wasn't just Nazis who were interested in that kind of visuality. From what I understand, Rockefeller actually for his campaign also used similar visual modes. I mean, she is a pioneer of cinema, documentary cinema, in that way, in the way she framed subjects with her camera.
I was going to say female. Not to cut you off, but female directors at that time, let alone even in today's time, is phenomenal. I mean, if we were to step away from some of the work that she had done, you would think that having a dedication to her work, as a pioneer within the field from a feminist perspective, could be quite interesting. But I think, as we'll dive into in a bit, I think. If there was an exhibition dedicated to her, given her association with the Nazi Party, that my guess is it probably wouldn't be necessarily well received.
Yeah, but I think it's very interesting what you say, because I grew up in Germany and was educated here, and I was always under the impression that we knew about Leni Riefenstahl. We had sort of dissected clips of her work, and I talk a moment by its only clips of her work, and in terms of understanding, gaining some visual literacy, what were sort of Nazi propaganda ways of establishing this effect, this sort of how were they so adept in seducing people into their political program, and aesthetics was an important point in that. But when I first went to the US, first to work and then to go to graduate school, I was so struck when I heard that film students in the US, for instance, would watch those documentaries in class in their entirety. I was quite struck that it wasn't forbidden or anything. And that, of course, with all critical readings, but that they would, from a film point of view, from a sort of cinematic point of view, critical cinematography, would study Leni Riefenstahl. I mean, I think for a long time, I don't know how it is right now in 2021, but until very recently, a German film school would have abstained from that kind of curriculum.
Sure. And I think that really ties into our next question. Talking about, this film that she made, Triumph of the Will, you had said in your book that it's not allowed to be shown in its entirety in Germany without an educational context attached to it. Can you tell us in more detail about, we've already kind of touched into why it's controversial for obvious reasons, but why can it not be shown in its entirety?
Yeah. When I did some research, I didn't put everything in my book at that time, but I just thought that everything or all Nazi expressions were, or I was under the assumption were just forbidden in 1945 or soonly thereafter with the end of World War II or with denazification. But from what I understand, or that they were just plainly banned, because they were often talked about as banned films, or Mein Kampf being a banned book. But exactly because how do you ban things in a democratic state becomes a completely different question, without appearing to be not really fulfilling the promise or the image that you're supposedly, it's quite far off from that enlightened
it almost
society
seems like
that
a
has
dictatorship. It's like you can only listen to this, but you can't listen to this. And it seems a bit ironic, if that's the right word. It's like, you want to be open, but we're not going to let you do this stuff. But it's like, but the previous partly wouldn't let us do certain things. So don't you think that maybe you're eating your own words a little bit? So how do we find that balance?
Exactly. So that, and then on top of it, let's not forget, during the Cold War, it was extremely important for Germany, not just the West Germany itself, but for the international community to say, see, West Germany is a free country, whereas East Germany, under the quote-unquote yoke of socialism, is unfree. Everyone has to tout the party line, or you'll be censored, or you won't be able to work, or worse, you will be imprisoned, right? So what happened with Triumph of the Will is not unsimilar to Mein Kampf, which we talk about perhaps in afterwards, is that had it been freely circulated, it could have been banned on the grounds, but those are difficult grounds, of incitement of the masses, because it shows an aesthetics of Aryan supremacy. Now, these are legally very hard to define things on the one hand side. So on the other hand, within the German self-understanding, it's important that these laws exist. So it was mainly made impossible on grounds of copyright, because it had been commissioned by the German Reich, by the Third Reich.
And this was Triumph of the Will or Mein Kampf?
Triumph of the Will.
Okay.
There's also a copyright story to Mein Kampf, but let's stick with Triumph of the Will first. And so it needed to have both permission, and you would have to pay Leni Riefenstahl because she was still alive. So it had to have both the permission of the German state and her permission, and she would get royalty fees on top of it every time it was shown in Germany. So that would have been really unthinkable in many ways. Although I believe after her death, there were a couple of screenings in late night German TV, but because it had an 18 plus age rating, it could only be shown after 11 p.m. But since then, the copyright has fallen. Since her death, the copyright has fallen to the German state, and the German state generally doesn't allow. You have to petition, the federal archives for you to be able to show it, and you have to prove that you are contextualizing it within an educational program. Because although this is not being said, it's said, it's inciting the masses, or it has anti-Semitic. All of her films, by the way, that were produced in that time, or it has anti-Semitic references, and so on. I think what is not really spoken is the idea that Nazi aesthetics, National Socialist aesthetics, are so seductive that decades and decades of German education is not able to rein in the potential of these artistic works.
And I think it's interesting your use of the word seductive, because I think one of the things I know I do in my own lessons with, my teaching, et cetera, is when we talk about controversial items, I think people are afraid to admit that it looks good. And, if we think about it from a publicity standpoint, if it looked bad, then it wouldn't have taken off necessarily. If it hadn't had the hook, I think that's the thing to draw people in. And there was, if you look at the context at the time, Germany had lost World War I. They were in severe debt, and yet they were expected to pay off all these war debts as well to various different countries. And so they were in absolute destitution. You have this individual who says, I can fix this. I can make this better. And, people ate it up because they felt like there was a hope and there was a dream behind it. And I think that is interesting that despite the warning labels basically attached to each of these items, it seems to me that there's a quiet recognition that these things are still attractive regardless.
Yeah, and that they have a sort of mass momentum, that it is something about that it draws you in. I sometimes use seductive because I
think it's the right word.
Because it's striking, because there seems to be this idea that within the German public education system where, you spend, or up till now, this might be changing at some point soon, or has changed in some parts of Germany. We don't have a unified school system here. So it's very much on a federal, on a state-by-state basis of how they teach the Nazi past. But, as I said, born in the early 1970s, for me, it was very early on. And for about 5 years in my schooling, we would look at the Nazi past through different lenses, through different, classes, be it in German class, be it in social sciences or in history. And then, you do the same thing once over. So it was a very important part of education. I'm not talking about the quality of this education necessarily, but it was part of the school curriculum. But there is this idea that something about, especially about the aesthetic products or the aesthetic expression, artistic production of that time, makes your critical faculties collapse or endangers them, right? Mm-hmm. And that's why I very often use this phrase, seductive.
Well, and you have to think about it. They hired the best. They hired the best to get their product out, and it worked. So, I think those sorts of things we have to keep in mind, is that they were always looking for the best quality. And so they retrieved the results for a long time that they were looking for.
Yeah, but, I think that's a sort of, it's very interesting that on the one hand, at some things, we could perhaps say that they are the best proverbially, but then also think about the kind of art that was destroyed in Germany at the same time, right? Yeah. The people who were exiled, theater, literature, visual art.
The book burning, just the book burning alone.
Exactly. So, but they were very, let's say, effective. I think the effectiveness of that kind of monumental fascist aesthetics is something that we still contend with today. As I was preparing for our meeting today, I read again, some people even, there were critics of George W. Bush's Mission Accomplished speech on where they were likening it to the kind of camera angles and the way the speech was done to that kind of National Socialist aesthetics. The same is true for the previous president of the United States. It's very effective. On multiple levels.
Absolutely.
Visually, affectively, and so on. It seems to still hold us, hold a sway on people. And that's what, none of us are free from that. I think that's important. Perhaps something that's worth sort of keeping in mind, that none of us are sort of who's ever been in a crowd. Not every crowd is the same kind of crowd, of course, But this kind of, I think this has gotten a bit out of vogue. But when I was growing up and going through this curriculum, sort of mass phenomena, sort of how the sort of effects of a mass on critical thinking or not thinking were always sort of at the center. But now that I think of it, it says it's of course an extremely, at once very true, and on the other hand, very problematic notion that masses are per se open to this kind of abuse or use for the worse instead of the better.
Absolutely. So if we could kind of switch and talk about Mein Kampf a little bit.
Yeah.
And I had thought before we talked that it was actually banned, like completely banned. You can't read it in Germany, you can't own a copy, nothing. And you said that is not the case. And that its publication concerns, as you'd already mentioned previously, are issues due to copyright. And this led to a discussion on what it means for items to actually be, quote unquote, banned in Germany. And what does banning actually mean?
Exactly.
And you had said previously that bans are political maneuvers that are part of Germany's rehabilitation. But these political decisions to ban Nazi materials are very complicated. So could you explain to our listeners what you mean by this?
Yeah. So I think one part we've already covered. So there's Nazi materials that are very easily to be recognized, such as, Nazi symbols that they have employed widely in different parts of their political organization. With Mein Kampf, I actually, for the longest time in my life, also thought it was banned because you could not buy it in Germany. But we also know, of course, that again, banning something outright does not really jive well with the idea of a liberal democracy, right? Mm-hmm. That's one thing. There's one exception to this, and that is usually regulations around public decency as they pertain to the protection of minors, for instance, which I think most of us would agree are quite important. So Absolutely. Those who are not protected, cannot protect themselves, are protected. But for instance, people like Marjorie Hines, who's a legal scholar and a free speech advocate, has also often pointed out restrictions that are supposed to protect children are often used for much broader infringements, but on freedom of expression. But that's just as an aside. And I think we can come up with examples from popular culture, or when it comes to LGBT plus visibility, for instance. This has been often used to curtail queer expression, for instance. But when we come to Mein Kampf, so one, it's not very politically advantageous to ban something yet. And let's not forget, in Austria, you could always buy Mein Kampf right around, just across the border. In all neighboring countries, I think, of Germany, you can buy Mein Kampf. I don't know where you bought your copy.
I think I bought mine on Amazon.
On Amazon?
Yeah.
Oh, Lord. I mean, that just makes me feel icky.
I mean, I wanted to have a copy just because I had this,
of course.
But I think it was Amazon. So
no, but for me, this is sort of how hard it is to wrap your mind around if you're sort of coming from this background, right, that I come from. But in any case, so, but what I learned as I was doing the research in terms of how is actually the legal situation was that the copyright of Mein Kampf had actually fallen to the state of Bavaria with Hitler's death. Because of his estate that was still in Munich. So he maintained a residence in Munich, and the sort of paperwork for Mein Kampf was filed there. So the state of Bavaria actually prohibited any kind of reproduction within Germany, and only allowed foreign reproductions abroad for those countries or publishers that had already acquired rights to publish it prior to 1945. So now we can sort of think or muse about what had happened had the publisher not prevented the circulation of Mein Kampf. It is very probable, because of the anti-Semitic expressions, the clear anti-Semitism that goes through Mein Kampf, that it would have been indexed, right? That it would have been banned. But in an interesting way, they never wanted to get into that. So why didn't they want to get into it? You could just as well publish it, then get it indexed, and that's it, and then perhaps it's been reviewed every few years. And I think here again, it's very important that this was a sort of assurance from the German side that sort of the non-publication, the non-publishing of Mein Kampf was seen as an assurance of a commitment to liberal democracy, right? And again, as a promise to never again. And here we again have that contradiction that it is through banning certain expressions that this is sort of being upheld. Now, a lot of advocates, free speech advocates who deal with the larger question of hate speech and see, also ask, how does the criminalization of anti-Semitism by law, they see the same problem with that as they see with hate speech laws overall, which is, I think there is an understanding that speech has consequences and that speech can spill over into and legitimize action. And so very often the thought is if we use the law to criminalize certain expressions, then the state shows, or the society that accepts these laws, shows that there's no toleration of these kind of hateful expressions, of anti-Semitic expressions, and so on. And that's a very slippery slope, of course. So it's on the one hand very important, but on the other hand, it becomes unfortunately a slippery slope that does not always protect those it is supposed to be protecting. So it's more about the self-assurance of the German state, it seems to me, than about per se protecting Jewish populations within and without Germany. But the official narrative is, of course, that it's exactly doing that.
So if I understand correctly, rather than, put in the proper paperwork, which you would for any publication, and then give the impression that you, as in the state or whatever, has a vested interest in wanting to keep this book alive, that it's better to sort of wash your hands of it to some degree, even though it's a liberal democracy, etc. The last thing you want is to get stamped with this accusation that you're making an active effort to make something which is taboo accessible, or potentially more accessible, in an environment where it is very much tarnished.
I mean, accessible, it has been always, well, not always, but it has been, people just used to buy it in Austria or, in Holland or wherever, or in Belgium.
Amazon.
Or Amazon, and then bring it back to Germany. So, it wasn't never, and I think this is also important to note, it was never about complete suppression. And since the advent of the internet, that was, and that's why I use this one phrase, it's sort of technically difficult and politically not necessarily wanted. These kind of bans, you could be penalized if you had Mein Kampf at home, that was a different thing. Neo-Nazis who had been raided by the police, active neo-Nazis who committed crimes, that it could be penalized. But now I lost my train of thought. But sort of what is more important about, it was less about, I think, accessibility or inaccessibility, but about legitimization versus delegitimization. I think we have to understand these laws as delegitimizing first and foremost Nazi expressions.
Okay.
Yeah. So these are not complete bans. When we think of censorship in the classic historical sense, it was about suppressing the publishing of something, banning something before it an expression before it meets an audience. That's the idea of pre-clearance censorship. But what we have, I think, for quite some time now is actually that delegitimization becomes much more important than banning per se. Rather than making something inaccessible is to literally or figuratively criminalize a certain expression.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's also sorry to be going on too long, but just to say, and on the 17th year of Hitler's death, actually, Mein Kampf became part of the public domain. And that was 2015. And so leading up to 2015, there were a lot of discussions in Germany because it would be clear that anyone could just print and flood the market with Mein Kampf if they so please, if they wish to do that. And what they decided on, and also, I think periodically there's also in the German public this idea of what would be in today's parlance maybe called the nanny state, that, we're emancipated enough to be able to read Mein Kampf without falling under the sway of National Socialist ideology. And so there was a lot of critique already that it wasn't available periodically within different political camps. And so what they did is the Institute for Zeitgeschichte in Munich published an annotated version, quite a heavy one, heavily annotated, critical reading version of Mein Kampf, which is now available. I have not read it, but but it is now available, and that was a way of dealing with it. If it had come out in an annotated fashion, I think then we would have seen how those laws would have been put into place. I would think that it would have been indexed.
And I was going to say, I think the copy that I have is also annotated. It's not just here's the book, but there's also a write-up in the beginning of it to give you sort of a bit of background context as well.
No, it's a heavily annotated edition. I don't think, if you had it, you'd know it.
Mine's normal book size, not 12 encyclopedias. But if we could kind of just step aside for a little bit and take this idea of banning a little bit further. In your book, you state that bans, and I'm presuming bans by the state, or the German state for that matter, have become difficult to enforce and somewhat unnecessary. And I know we've talked about that already a little bit. But that the people you have researched produced now what you call partial silencing through self-censorship. So can you kind of tell us a bit more about this?
Yeah, of course. So when we say censorship today, what do we actually mean in a context like Germany? In other places it can look differently. If we were to talk about Turkey, we would also talk about it differently. But generally, I would say, just to emphasize the first part of that question, again, with the advent of the internet, with the digital availability of anything and everything, complete bans have become increasingly difficult, although we know also a lot about, content management, or the other side of it, internet censorship, of course, is a topic for many places at different times. But when we talk about censorship today, outright banning is really a minuscule part of it, that someone has to recall a book and destroy a book. Happens perhaps when there's someone's personality rights violated. There was a case like that in the early 2000s, I think, in Germany with Maxim Biller's novel Estra, where a person who recognized herself as the main character in the book without sufficient alienation successfully got the book taken out of the market, which is what basically means it is banned because it was violating their personality rights, But, in other instances that I've seen, so criminalization is, of course, one way. Banning we've talked about, but there's also something, a process that we know, perhaps less from Germany, but other places like Turkey, for instance, targeting, that an exhibition is targeted by, let's say, a daily newspaper with the address, and then, people come and perhaps protest, which is, of course, within the realm of free expression, but perhaps threaten others who want to visit an exhibition or so on. discouragement. And of course, in a context like Germany, much more important is non-funding. In a place where the art world is heavily reliant on state subsidies, and not just the art world, but artists' livelihood to be able to produce and show their work is very often predicated on state subsidy. Non-funding to sort of explicitly or implicitly be signaled that certain kind of content will not receive funding has an extremely chilling effect, Yeah.
So would you say this partial silencing is through sort of the quiet removal of funds potentially by the state, or maybe peer pressure from others to prevent people from going through with their projects?
Yeah, I think peer pressure from others always plays a role. But I think it's the non-awarding of funding. Within recent German history, and it's actually a case that I talk about in the book that you
and we'll get into that as well.
Referenced. Yeah, the sort of explicit withdrawal of funding is something that we publicly know of. Only like one case that we can talk about in more detail, but it's sort of not receiving funding at all. Sort of being rejected over and over again by a committee who's not obliged to tell you why your proposal has been rejected, right? Very often it's said that in Germany, arts funding is likewise free and that it's awarded by committees of experts. But the thing is that we must not forget that these committees are also, the way in which these committees are configured is not necessarily subject to public knowledge. It can be, it cannot be. That's one thing. And I think that's been historically for some time an issue. There's been a lot of discussion within the freedom of the arts sort of field if non-funding should be seen as a censoring motion, because, non-funding does not necessarily preclude you from doing a certain kind of artistic work. But again, in an art world where, like Germany, where so much hinges upon funding by the state, to get a sense, however tacitly, that certain things will not be funded is a very strong discouragement. Whereas in Turkey, where you have very little arts funding, that means monies that you would get to realize a project, people are very often confronted with censorship after the fact, after they've opened an exhibition, after they put on a play, because they do it out of pocket, or they put together crowdfunding, or whatever other means they might have.
Yeah. Yeah.
So then funding preferences are at an important are the point of governing the arts. Then things become much harder to discern, as in contrast to, let's say, I open an exhibition about a topic and then the next day the police raids it. I mean, that's very clear, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, if we could just sort of provide an example of this idea of, silencing by the state or self-censorship. When I was looking through your research, there was an expression that came to mind, which I'm sure you've heard of, is no good deed shall ever go unpunished. And in your research, you discuss an artistic exhibition called Regarding Terror that went terribly wrong and was heavily criticized by the German press and by German society. Can you tell us, firstly, how this exhibition came about, when it was, and then why it became so controversial?
Yeah, of course. And, and perhaps surprisingly or perhaps unsurprisingly, it will also lead us back to the Nazi past. Regarding Terror was an exhibition that it did actually open its doors in 2005, but it had a long and difficult journey. It took as its topic the media perception of the Red Army faction. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the Red Army faction from the German context, it was a militant left group, armed group, that assembled in the late 60s, early 70s from disillusioned splinters of the German students, socialist student movements, and other left-leaning and revolutionary movements. And in the beginning, it attacked sort of symbols of capitalism or militarism, and in time also turned against attacks of leading industry figures, capital, who were to express both the capitalist imperialist system and as a specifically German inflection of that. We have different groups, Brigata Rosso in Italy, or the underground in the US, for instance, with whom they're often discussed in conjuncture, even though they have very particular national issues that they're dealing with, each of them, although they saw themselves very much in the anti-imperialist and internationalist tradition. But in the case of the Red Army faction, part of their targets was also the Nazi connections, those who had been functionaries in the Nazi party, who had directly or indirectly, many of them directly, I have to say, profited from the Nazi reign of terror, from genocide, and from the dispossession of Jews within Germany and within the wider European context, and who had been passed by denazification and were actually in high positions within within West Germany. So it was a very difficult, I think, episode within Germany. The violence that they perpetrated, first against buildings and then against these persons, who for them symbolized the continuity to the Nazi state and to fascism. It was I think, like all of these kind of domestic militant movements, are hard to deal with politically. But for Germany, especially because, as I say in the book, German terror was sort of something inconceivable. That Germans would take again to weapons to kill civilians was unthinkable in the sort of Federal Republic of Germany, in this beacon of liberal democracy, in this liberated, emancipated, maturing democracy.
Yeah.
And so, and without, in any way minimizing the violence that was perpetrated by the Red Army faction, the very existence of the Red Army faction itself really was a dilemma for the German state. But notably, the RAF, many of its members were either killed or killed themselves, were incarcerated. Some of them had fled into what was then still the Eastern Bloc and disbanded sometime in the early 1990s. But it's been an episode that has been largely silenced. And it's very interesting. There's no memory regime. Germany, which is sort of the champion of social political memory, with all its public commemoration of the atrocities of World War II, has no memory regime when it comes to the history of German militancy. And that has...
Yeah, I was going to say, do you think there was an attempt to sort of sweep it under the rug, to protect their sort of reputation?
Yeah, I think there was exactly that. It was sort of seen like a deviation from an otherwise, progressive, linear path. But the reasons for why it's been silenced is important to understand why then censorship becomes even acceptable. Again, within a liberal democracy. I'm using this term not because I'm invested in it, but because it's sort of the term that is being used in this self-assuring way And Germany has periodically had to both assure itself and the international community that they're not veering off that path. A reunified Germany, for instance, had to, over and over perform the assurance of being this liberal democracy where fascism would not be able to take hold ever again.
Right.
And something like the Red Army faction really brought this whole, historically and to this day, really shakes the fundamental assumptions that Germany has about itself. A, because it was a kind of violence that was seen as impossible within the new Germany. B, and I think we must not forget that, is that in answer to this terrorism, as it was then also called, Germany enacted a string of laws, which we now know are very much similar to what the Patriot Act did, or some of the UK laws and in quote-unquote counter-terrorism, that are very hard to align or sort of reconcile with each of these countries' constitutions in a way, right? That are the very exact opposite of what a democracy should look like, the kind of surveillance that is being done, the kind of, sorry.
Well, could you tell us a bit about this exhibition? Because
oh yes, of course. Sorry, I'm veering off too much.
It's okay.
But I just want to say that these topics all sort of came up, of course. Sort of. Let me just say these two things, and then I come to the exhibition itself. So, why was the Red Army faction, the history of the Red Army faction, silenced? Why didn't have a stable memory regime? And I think two things I want to highlight here. We could say more, but one is because, however misguided the violence of the Red Army faction was, it insisted on disrupting the idea that Germany had been re-civilized after 1945, that denazification had actually happened, that this Western Germany was a distinct state from its previous Nazi incarnation, right? That's one thing. And the other thing is that, some of the surveillance measures I mentioned, but also the way in which these people were incarcerated, when they were incarcerated, the kind of solitary confinement protocols, force feeding when they were on hunger strike, not being able to see their lawyers. All of these are actually constitutionally guaranteed rights, but also not just from the German constitution, but also to be free from this kind of harm, but also all international agreements that Germany is part of. And Germany undermined all of these protocols in the 70s and 80s, right? So, I think these are two reasons.
And you tied this into like a Guantanamo Bay sort of comparison.
Exactly, yeah. Right. And we forgot about a lot of this. And then it came up again when the global war on terror began, and countries have sort of even furthered these kind of laws under the heading of counterterrorism that are not really that contradict all other kinds of human rights laws and national laws. The exhibition was really about a reckoning. So the idea of it was planned by a team at KW, and Blumstein, Felix Ensslin, Klaus Biesenbach, they asked Klaus Biesenbach to come on. KW in Berlin, one of its premier contemporary art spaces. They thought very hard about the project and how to, and they were sort of in part concerned. I don't want to, shorten their sort of rationale for the exhibition too much, but I had a chance to talk to one of the curators, and Blumstein said, it's so interesting that we talk so much about the past in Germany, but in a way the past stops in 1945, perhaps in 1960, and after that we don't learn anything about German history. And for those of us who were born in the 70s, the Red Army faction was something that we saw, whenever you would go to the post office or any public space, you would see the wanted posters of the protagonists of these movements. I mean, we grew up with the images of these people. So, maybe it's time to revisit that period of both left-wing militancy and the violence of the state of that time, and how could we do this? And notably, they wrote a concept note and they got funding, federal funding for this exhibition. But before a finalized, and the idea was to have, artworks that deal with that period and have historical documentation with it, newspaper clippings of the time, video material, TV materials, and so on. Some of these artworks were produced contemporaneously with the Red Army at the time of the activities of the Red Army faction, and some of them were retrospective looks at that time, which sometimes in Germany is called die Bleierne Zeit, the time of lead, that went very sort of heavily in different phases of this, of this sort of struggle between state and this militant group. But a preliminary concept was leaked, apparently, to a widow of one of the victims of the RAF, a very high-standing functionary in the German industries and later the German state. And she was able, together with other families of those whose loved ones had been victims of the RAF, to mobilize the state apparatus to A, scandalize in the media against the exhibition, and B, do something what we at least officially don't know. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen. But to officially, for all of us to see, for the German federal arts funding, or the agency who allotted that funding, to say, we give you they had already spent part of the money in preparation of the exhibition, but to say, for you to get the rest of the monies that have been promised to you, you must allow the Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung, which is an educational arm of the Ministry of the Interior, to run the educational program alongside the exhibition. So that is an infringement on the art world that is very heavy-handed, to say that, I'm not saying the Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung has, in part very wonderful works by great authors, and there's great educators and pedagogues there, and that's a different story. But let's not forget, it's under the patronage of the German Ministry of the Interior. So that's an interference into art or an arts institution that is really not acceptable. Right? Okay. Yeah. Sorry to be going on so long.
No, I think that's the thing when we talk about something that is so controversial, there's no easy answer. And I think also as well, when we talk about things that can very easily upset large groups of people for good reason, there needs to be, as you put it, an index. They're almost like a very explicit caveat to say, I need to give you the background first before I answer the question, because the last thing I need is for the person on the receiving end to make conclusions that don't need to be made. And also to demonstrate on your side, you've done your homework and you're looking at it from a variety of angles.
Yeah. And I think what is also important to me is to say that censorship these days tends to not work in a very straightforward fashion. It takes many actors, and very often it's each actor's perhaps very minuscule kind of intervention that then adds up to a censorship motion, as I would call it, or to the act of censorship usually consists of, it's very rarely, that it's the kind of, I sort of imagine a Chaplin-esque dictator making a phone call and say, this is forbidden. Not that it doesn't exist in our world today. Of course it does. But I think especially when it comes to aesthetic expressions and art, it's very often, this person calls that person. That person says, well, don't you think, it's much less this kind of, because it's not really accepted to censor, because we're so invested in this idea that a place like Germany is a free country. Censorship rarely happens by decree. So it takes a lot of different actors and a lot of different sort of players to come together in something where their intention might be really to discourage an exhibition or to close it down. It might be their intention, but their intention might also just be like, oh, something's wrong here, or we need to do something, or, I don't think this is okay. Or I'm not saying that necessarily leads to censorship, but very often when you break it down and when we talk about the different actors who are engaged in, who make that in the end something can be banned today, not like 250 years ago or something, or 300 years ago. It takes a lot of people to make that work, and a lot of, not just in terms of mass, but it takes a lot of different kind of powers.
And it seems like there's a lot of stopping and starting as well.
Yeah.
You can't just proceed with an idea and then assume that you can kind of get through it to the other end. But there's a lot of red tape that you're going to have to go through, and a lot of apprehension on the receiving end as to whether or not this could blow up. And again, that whole no good deed shall ever go unpunished, even if you're going at it from the standpoint of, I just want to have a civil discussion about it, could end up turning into something where, a civil discussion is just never going to happen. So, and I think that kind of ties into one of the last questions I'd like to ask, is that it seems to me that the German narrative, based on the discussion that we've had today, runs the risk of limiting civilians from having what we've talked about as freedom of expression, quote unquote, by only accepting certain, and I put this in quotations, and I want to be careful about this, but by accepting certain positive points of view to be permitted in society as opposed to others. Do you think this could create potential barriers for civil discussion on differing points of view? And if we could follow that up, as people, how do we as people respect the past and the history that has happened, while also providing openings for future alternative, differing points of view and discussions? And is that even possible?
Yeah. I think we're, as you're well aware, and I think probably has also motivated some of your interest in this topic and this series that you're doing on banned sort of things, banned books or banned expressions. There's a lot of talk, and I'm just sort of want to mark it. I don't want to get into it. And why I'm not getting into it will become clear when I talk a little bit about how I think of freedom of expression, perhaps. But when we see how much talk there is today about cancel culture and who it's leveraged by, who sort of leverages this accusation against whom, where there's a very interesting notion that one has never been as unfree. This is true, I think, for the UK context. I've heard this a lot in the US. I've heard this a lot in Germany, interestingly, as well. So there is freedom of expression has moved, I think, explicitly into a sort of, at the moment, although I don't like this militaristic language, but it's a battlefield. But let's remember why freedom of expression, why we have something like freedom of expression laws. These were instated, or in their contemporary configuration, let's say. I don't want to give a historical overview, but we usually think of them as protected speech by those who are politically and socially not as protected, who are more vulnerable, for those who are minoritized in society. Right? So it is exactly the tyranny, to avert the tyranny of the masses. Now we know today that these are not objective terms. We know that sometimes the very laws that are supposed to, for instance, protect people from hate speech, supposedly vulnerable people to protect vulnerable people from hate speech, are used by those in power to shield themselves from criticism. Yeah, and to say, oh no, this little group of students is actually perpetrating hate speech against me. Or this group of feminists is actually targeting me or something, right? Where there's an inversion of the power position within history. I've come to think about, and we have to be clear about what the law can and cannot do. Very often we think of, and I have been part of legal activism initiatives where we try to to legally cement freedom of the arts, for instance. But the law itself is also not objective. So it also doesn't give protection just by virtue of being law. The way in which these laws are being used, and again, those who are more sort of subaltern groups are much less able to use these laws for their own protection than are people who are part of the majority, not numerically necessarily, but in terms of power. So I've come to see increasingly the question of freedom of expression not as a determinable endpoint. Right? I don't think there's X, and that is the point of freedom of expression. But it's really a terrain of struggle, of active struggle, where we have to debate speech and expression in terms of power, place, and history. And when we say we want to struggle for freedom of expression, it means that we struggle to create the conditions in which we can have these discussions without making those who are vulnerable more vulnerable, without giving those in power more power, but to create I know this sounds perhaps slightly esoteric, but to create these kind of equitable and equal ways of discussing, rather than thinking of freedom of speech as something that's out there if I can do X,
Right.
I know, and the last disclaimer, but I also don't mean this to be, I know that even this description that I just gave can be used to make those who are vulnerable, to make those who are minoritized even more vulnerable, minoritized, or even perpetrate further violence on them.
Yeah.
But at the moment, this is sort of my working definition. How can we really create the conditions in which there is indeed even the possibility to talk about what free speech is? Because I think we're way, way, way away from that point that we can even talk about it.
That's really, really interesting. Well, before we go, can you give our listeners a teaser of what you'll be talking about in our bonus episode, which will be available to our patrons later this month?
Yes, of course, with pleasure. So you've kindly invited me for a bonus episode, and I'd like to talk to you about my book, The National Frame.
Oh, you mean this one? Violence. This one I have right here in my hands?
Yes, exactly.
Oh, I don't know if anyone on Patreon can see, but yeah, it's right here. Very interesting, by the way.
Art and State Violence in Turkey and Germany. And that is sort of a deeper dive into how and why, even in this globalized world and in this globalized art world, the production, the circulation, and the presentation of art still remain refracted through the vocabulary of the national and the national frame.
Excellent. I have to say, thank you so much. And that's it from us, from Coffee and Cocktails with your host, Dr. Anne Wand. Again, I'd like to thank Banu for joining us at the studio this afternoon. Additional links to today's topic will be available in the show notes. And if you have any thoughts on today's show, any at all, feel free to leave a comment or write us directly. We love hearing from you. In the meantime, we'd like to showcase our monthly CNC winner, where we pick out of a hat a Coffee and Cocktails follower from our social media platforms to win a piece of merchandise. And the winner this month is Nikki Makovicki. Please feel free to reach out to us to get your prize. Otherwise, that's it for now. Thanks for listening and have a great week.